Hey, what's happening, everybody? I hope you're all doing amazing out there today. If you are new here, welcome to Movies Never Say Die, your home for 80s and 90s retro movie content. This is Volume 9 of my Forgotten 80s Movies Worth Not Forgetting series. All of the past volumes, of course, will be linked in this video for you guys to check out later. But today, I have another 10 forgotten gems. This volume will have some action, a little bit of sci-fi, plenty of comedy, and more. So let's get into it. Kicking this volume off is an action-adventure comedy about a couple of down-on-their-luck fortune hunters who are hoping to cash in on a hoard of gold in J. Lee Thompson's Firewalker from 1986, starring Chuck Norris, Louis Gossett Jr., Melody Anderson, and Will Sampson. This treasure hunting movie didn't really strike gold at the box office, and it was dinged heavily for feeling like a derivative mashup of Raiders of the Lost Ark with Romancing the Stone, but I contend that Firewalker is a great time, and I think it's primarily due to the just charming and comical chemistry between Norris and Gossett Jr. Now, Gossett Jr. wasn't necessarily known for comedy, but he was a very versatile actor, so he delivers the charisma needed for this role with ease. Norris certainly is out of character in this performance, and despite weaving his action in whenever he can, he is a little bit stiff in places. However, overall, I do think he brings this movie an effective comical energy. It's certainly a by-the-numbers adventure plot, but it still delivers a ride that's filled with loads of action and comical banter and splashes of romance. And sure, it gets a bit silly, and it may not have worked in Firewalker's favor when it was released, but I think looking back now, it just kind of gives this movie a fun-loving charm that enables it to entertain more now than it did back in '86. We're jumping from adventure over to comedy for this next film about a teenage girl who just wants to be a journalist but feels she's being discriminated against. So, while her parents are out of town, she cuts off her hair, she changes her wardrobe, and enrolls at a rival school as a boy in 1985's Just One of the Guys, directed by Lisa Gottlieb, starring Joyce Heiser, Clayton Ronner, Billie Jane, William Zadka, and Sherilyn Fenn. Admittedly, this movie does flow effortlessly through all the teen comedy tropes from the era in terms of plot points and character arcs, but I don't think it gets in the way of the fun this movie delivers. I think the performances are filled with a lot of energy and tons of charisma. I think Heiser really is great in the lead. She's comical, she feels sincere, and I think her chemistry with Billy Jacoby is just perfect for their sibling dynamic. I really love their scenes together, and sure, this movie's focal attempts at humor are all related to the gender swap concept, but I still think there's a charming sense of humor in the writing overall. Just One of the Guys kind of relies on its simple premise, but it keeps a very steady pace. It doesn't try to get too sappy, and the writing manages to give this story just enough heart at the core to kind of tug at the heartstrings. So with strong performances, an amusing story, and plenty of vibrant 80s music, Just One of the Guys is a timeless 80s comedy. We're going to stick in the genre of comedy for this next film. It's based on the radio and TV series of the same name, and it follows the crime-solving exploits of LAPD Sergeants Joe Friday and Pep Streebek in 1987's Dragnet, directed by Tom Mankiewicz, starring Tom Hanks, Dan Aykroyd, Christopher Plummer, Harry Morgan, and Dabney Coleman. This was another movie that was criticized a lot when it was released. It did very well at the box office, but some scoffed at the modernization of the source material. Yet despite all of that, I think Dragnet is a hilarious action comedy that focuses heavily on the comedy. Now, the pagan angle of the story may not work for everybody. It is a bit out there, but I think it helps give this film a bizarre energy that just kind of ramps up the oddities of this adventure. I think Aykroyd delivers just a masterclass performance in comedy, feeling like he was born for this just crisp and dry performance. I think Hanks also dives nicely into his comedic roots as well, and together they're just a world-class comedic 1-2 punch. And sure, some of the jokes try a bit too hard and some of the story angles get a bit too wild, but I can appreciate the swing this movie took and just not wanting to rely on the nostalgia, but instead relying on the just comedic brilliance of its two leads. And for that aspect, I think this silly little comedy still entertains very much today. We're jumping way back to the early 80s for this next gritty crime thriller. Before Stallone was an action legend, he starred as Deke Da Silva, an NYPD detective that will take on an international terrorist in Bruce Malmuth's Nighthawk from 1981, also starring Rutger Hauer, Billy D. Williams, and Lindsay Wagner. Now, Stallone had already done Rocky, but he was far from the global icon that he would become when Nighthawks was released, and he never really would do another film quite like this until maybe I Can See You in 2002, but as it stands, Nighthawks holds up fantastic. It's a well-crafted, gritty, neo-noir cop thriller with a very methodical pace, and New York serving as the perfect playground for a cop chasing an international terrorist. Rutger Hauer is fantastic in this movie. He's equally charming and sadistic. He certainly steals the show over Stallone, but that's sort of what you want from a film centered around a maniacal villain. However, what I do think shines the most with Nighthawks is its 70s atmosphere and its flashy scoring and the artistic direction and cinematography. The story just layers the suspense excellently to ramp up the tension nicely, and with some good old-fashioned stunt work and practical effects, the back half of this film turns into a thrilling ride filled with plenty of action and style and lots of intrigue. From the early 80s, we're going to jump all the way to the late 80s for this martial arts action flick that admittedly does have a solid cult following. It centers on a group of the US's top fighters who will have to overcome their differences to team up against a South Korean team in a Taekwondo tournament in 1989's The Best of the Best, starring Eric Roberts, James Earl Jones, Sally Kirkland, Chris Penn, and many others. Now, I will admit this isn't a movie I'm extremely high on. I do enjoy it as a late 80s martial arts action romp, but I certainly don't love it as much as most people do. The story, I think, is solid, it's straightforward, and it's familiar. I also think the action showcases a buffet of effective fight choreography, but to me, the casting is just a bit off. I love Eric Roberts, don't get me wrong, but he just didn't really work for me in this movie. He kind of makes the film just a bit too laughable during his most emotionally driven moments, and despite being a fine actor, he's just not the best of the best for this movie, and I don't think Chris Penn was either. That's just my opinion. I think, though, outside of the changes I would have made to the casting, that I still can easily appreciate the nostalgia that this movie delivers all these years later. I didn't really watch this movie as much growing up, but after watching it recently, I can still invest in the journey that it takes and all the threads of friendship and teamwork and competition, as much as they're beat over your head, are still more than enough to chew on between all the high adrenaline action sequences. We're stepping back in time 1 year to this next forgotten sci-fi action thriller. Years after making contact with aliens, a quarantine procedure has been implemented which allows aliens to integrate themselves into human society. In 1988's Alien Nation, starring James Caan, Mandy Patinkin, Terrence Stamp, and Peter Jason. This little movie would spawn a TV series that would run from 89 to 90, and it takes the traditional cop thriller and kind of drops it into a world blended with humans and aliens. Now, this movie definitely leans heavier into the cop thriller tropes than it does trying to explore the science fiction of it all, and I actually like that. I like how this movie kind of feels like the others I've seen, yet just has a twist that kind of makes it feel like something completely new. I think James Caan and Mandy Patinkin are great in the leads. I think Caan plays the tough as nails detective that we've seen before to a T, just kind of making the role his own. And Patinkin brings life to his role behind all the makeup as the alien who teams up with this bristly cop to solve a murder. I think Alien Nation admittedly goes through the genre motions, but it also delivers just a gritty visual atmosphere and feels like a futuristic look at our world. Some of the aliens in society humor is kind of amusing as well. The action is gritty and violent, and the scoring is very well done as well. The performances are strong, and this movie overall just puts all its pieces together to deliver a great ride. We're sticking in the sci-fi genre for this next forgotten flick, directed by John Carpenter, which follows an alien who takes the form of a woman's dead husband and has her drive him across the country to his destination point. In 1984, Starman, starring Jeff Bridges, Karen Allen, Charles Martin Smith, and Robert Phelan. To me, Starman is really unlike any other Carpenter film in that it takes what could be a high-octane sci-fi premise and crafts it into a sweet and heartfelt drama revolving around human compassion. This comes a lot through the intimate direction from Carpenter, but more so it comes from just the emotionally charged performances from Jeff Daniels and Karen Allen, who I think breathe so much life and sincerity and love into these characters. So I think with Allen and Daniels behind the wheel, you can't help but invest in this journey and root for their character's success. I do think Daniels gets a little bit too clunky in certain scenes, but that's sort of the point. This movie certainly does have its overly sappy moments, but for the most part, I think Carpenter keeps it surprisingly grounded and with strong scoring and fun, campy visual effects and an endearing amount of heart at the core of the story. Starman still holds up as a true hidden gem from the 80s. Next up, I have a time period comedy about organized crime that has never been so disorganized, when an everyday guy in the 1930s is forced into a life of crime to support his mother's skyrocketing medical bills. In 1984's Johnny Dangerously, starring Michael Keaton, Joe Piscopo, Danny DeVito, Maureen Stapleton, and Peter Boyle. This is another of those mid-80s comedies that kind of just came and went with little impact left, and it was actually kind of scoffed at for the dumb tone of its humor, but I actually think that dumb humor is perfect for the needs of this silly story and all the eccentric characters that fill it. And sure, there are a lot of dumb jokes and sexual innuendo and sight gags, but that isn't to say that Johnny Dangerously still doesn't have a clever sense of humor fueling it all. The direction from Amy Heckerling, I think, is very effective. The movie keeps a very fast pace, and the performance from Keaton is really just top notch for this amusing character. Keaton has great comedic timing in this role. He's really putting in the energy into the part. I think it gives this film just the true charismatic lead that it needs. And with other names like Henner and Piscopo and DeVito and DeLuise, there is no shortage of comically skilled actors that I think are all able to kind of elevate spots of writing that aren't as naturally effective. And when all is said and done, Johnny Dangerously is a hilarious 80s hidden gem. Now, this next action thriller does actually have a few Oscar nominations under its belt, and some would say it's maybe not so forgotten, but I still think it's worthy of an entry. It follows a couple of escaped convicts and a railway worker who get themselves stuck on a speeding train with no brakes in 1985's Runaway Train, starring Jon Voight, Eric Roberts, and Rebecca De Mornay. To me, Runaway Train is a movie that makes the most use of its focal elements. The story is able to pull the most intensity and the absolute most unnerving suspense from the plot. The performances from both Voight and Roberts pump life into their characters with their contrasting personalities serving the turns of the plot extremely well. Then you get the incredible direction, the strong cinematography, and the pulse-pounding scoring, and the result is a movie that can just pull you in and have you on the edge of your seat throughout the duration. The stunt work in this movie creates action sequences that still look very impressive today. Sure, there are spots of visual effects that don't hold up so well, but I mean, for the most part, Runaway Train still has a very crisp polish to it, and the performances from Voight and Roberts and De Mornay can still grab your attention and capture your imagination as this train races down the tracks with no brakes to true cinematic appeal. And closing out this volume is another action comedy that some will remember, but I think many people may have forgotten or never heard of. It follows a couple of street-smart cops fresh off vacation who must track down a drug dealer who tried to kill them in 1986's Running Scared, starring Gregory Hines, Billy Crystal, and Stephen Bauer. This was another movie that did pretty well at the box office, but never really struck with critics, yet the pairing of Crystal and Hines is all you really need to have a blast with Running Scared. The story does work through many of the tropes and all the familiar plot points, but it's a swift-moving buddy cop thriller, and it can just kind of pull you in and take you out on the case with these partners. I think Hines and Crystal are fantastic together. They have just enough similarities and just enough differences to complement the other well, and I think their energy together really is the pulse of this gritty but still lighthearted action flick. The overall construction of this movie may have been a little bit overly traditional, but to this day, I don't think Hines and Crystal get the credit that they deserve for the humor they brought to this movie as a duo. The music is upbeat, the action is nice and violent. Crystal and Hines are like peanut butter and jelly, and Running Scared is a true 80s hidden gem. And that's it for today, guys. That wraps up Volume 9 in my Forgotten 80s Movies Worth Not Forgetting series. 10 more forgotten gems from the decade, definitely worth watching. We're getting towards the end of this series with only one more volume to go. I really do hope you guys have been enjoying this ride back into the forgotten corners of 80s cinema. Be on the next lookout for the last volume, Volume 10, coming very soon. I hope to see you guys all back there for that one. And until then, movies never say die.
Jack Burton in the Pork Chop Express, and I'm talking to whoever's listening out there.
Survive a war, you gotta become war.
I suppose we have to register you as a lethal weapon.
You trying to say Jesus Christ can't hit a curveball?